This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
There's a lot to wrap up, and I'm not quite sure where to begin. When I talk to my students about Mandela, I say, oversimplifying of course, that Mandela did two very great things, or two very great and consequential things. The first was to help to inaugurate the armed struggle, and the next was to help end the armed struggle and move towards negotiations. And as things stand, I think within the historical and political community, it's probably fair consensus that he was correct in leading the armed struggle, though I'm one of those people who begin to think that there's a lot more to be discussed around, particularly the consequences of that event. And increasingly, as one listens to the way in which, listen to talk radio in South Africa, for example, today, you see there are a great deal of disaffected, particularly young people, who feel that Mandela somehow sold out on the struggle in the way that he elected, the particular way that he elected to move towards negotiations. Now, one of the problems with dealing with Mandela as a historical figure is that for a very long time, he's really not been the property of historians. The first biography of Mandela was Mary Benson, a journalist. The three biggest biographies of Mandela, including his autobiography, which was, of course, Stengelized by Richard Stengel, was Martin Meredith's and who's the other one? And Anthony Sampson. And that was a particular moment in which they wrote. And this was then followed by a series of interestingly shorter, very acute biographies, including one outstanding one by Tom Lodge, by Ella Kaboma, and there are others, including one in gestation by Colin Bundy. And these all focus on deeply historical questions. And they depart in many ways from the hagiography, from the teleological directions that Mandela himself follows in his own autobiography, and many of the other biographies follow. Now, how does one historicize Mandela? Well, the first is that it would have probably surprised many people that Mandela would be separated from the struggle, because the one thing that many people believed was that Mandela was of the struggle. He was a leader. He was not the leader. This was essential to the ANC's principle of collective leadership. And one of the interesting things about Mandela's authority is, of course, the way in which it was deferred, not only through his greatest advisors on the island, people like Sisulu, but particularly his relationship with Oliver Tambo, who really, I think without Oliver Tambo in London, there may not have been an ANC in 1990, or certainly not in the form. It might have looked a lot rather more like the Pan-African Congress. Now, the historians who are beginning to, as it were, address themselves seriously to Mandela studies, one direction is this extremely interesting question of the creation of the Mandela myth, his own role in cultivating his personality, but also the role of others in making Mandela a leader unlike all others. And we're only beginning to set out the ways in which this has been done. I think it's no accident, for example, that the role of the anti-apartheid movement, it's a hunch, can't quite prove it, but it doesn't seem to be a great accident that around the time that the anti-apartheid movement based in London began to decide to focus particular attention on Mandela the man, 77, 78, was the point at which the great figure, the great martyred figure of the liberation struggle in South Africa was Steve Biko. And I don't think that was entirely coincidental. The other interesting thing about these discussions is that Mandela exhibits to an extraordinary degree a kind of presence-absence. The fact that he was on Robben Island, away from the struggle, divorced from the struggle in many ways, involved in his own struggle, meant, as Tom Lodge reminds us, that he didn't carry the baggage of exile, of many bad decisions, but it also gave him the opportunity to rethink fundamentally his own position. And certainly the Mandela who comes out in 1990 is not the same as the Mandela who went in. Indeed, in some ways, the Mandela who comes out in 1990 looks rather more like the Lutuli whom he displaced around 1960, 1961. So there's a great deal more to be said about the creation of Mandela, the myth, and myth shouldn't simply be counterposed to reality, because myths are much more complicated than that. And questions like his dress, his manner, his demeanor, the kinds of imagery that Tom was talking about so interestingly, all these are part of this growing interest in understanding the grip, the hold of Mandela. Now, the other question, which has been very prominent, has been led by several commentators, journalists, but in particular, the excellent work that we heard about today from Stephen, and this relates to Mandela's membership of the Communist Party. Now, I've read the same things that most of you have, not always in the original. I'm pretty much persuaded that he was, in some form, at some time, a member of the Communist Party. But it seems to me that that question of his membership, and I can understand why it's irritated people like Stephen, Paul Truella, Irina Filatova, people who insist on his membership. It's important, not least, and not only because of the politics of the Cold War, but also because Mandela, as Hugh reminded us, was so assiduous in denying his membership. Now, one can certainly understand why he denied membership of the Communist Party at the Rivonia trial. It certainly wouldn't have helped him. One can understand why in prison, deep in bitter recriminations with Communist Party members like Mbeki and Harry Gwala, why Mandela did not want to admit to being a member of the Communist Party. But there is no reason, really, if one thinks about it, why Mandela, who was deeply reflective, both in prison and after, could not have said, yes, well, of course, I couldn't admit it before, but yes, there was a period in which we worked extremely closely with the Communist Party. And in some ways, readings of his work pretty much suggest that. So the question is, can we go beyond this question of membership, not membership? And actually, if you read Hugh's book, I think the question of membership is less interesting than the whole culture of exile in Zambia and the very different cultures of exile that occur in places like London. So I think one needs to not just say, was he a member of the Communist Party, and assume that gives you an answer, if that can be determined, but what it actually meant. What was the culture of the Communist Party? Was the Communist Party simply dominating and acting as the vanguard of the revolutionary struggle? Was the Communist Party manipulating Mandela, or was, as Mandela himself suggests, was he capable of manipulating the Communist Party too? As far as the latter is concerned, there is some evidence to suggest this may have been the case. It's quite plausible to believe that the Communist Party seized on Mandela around 1959, 1960, certainly after Sharpeville, and thought that he could be the most glamorous poster boy of a particular Johannesburg faction's attempt to establish predominance and leadership and direction of the struggle. It's also plausible to believe that Mandela, who always was in one form or another an African nationalist, sometimes an Africanist, impetuous, ambitious, felt that with the help of the Communist Party, he would be able to supplant the still extraordinarily large hold and statesmanlike qualities of Lutuli. And I think in many cases, in many ways, one can understand that relationship in that way. But I think we need a much deeper and more historically expansive view of what the Communist Party actually meant. Do we understand by the Communist Party simply an alliance with the Soviet Union, taking orders from Moscow? I suspect not. Do we understand the biggest and most important imprint of the Communist Party on the ANC's struggle in terms of its ideological influence? And I'm not even sure that that is the case. It seems to me that the Communist Party offered certain very important resources. On the one hand, in a ramshackle arrangement, the ANC was always a ramshackle arrangement. The Communist Party provided a great deal of direction. It offered resources and links both to the Soviet Union and at times to China. And perhaps more than anything else, it offered a sense of certainty, historical materialism, the science, at a time when the liberation movement in the 1970s, particularly late 60s and 70s, where the prospects of liberation in South Africa seemed so poor, the Communist Party was able to hold together and to persuade often a very vociferous and depressed exile community that it had the answer, that if it would simply hold the faith, that the future would change in its favor. The other thing that the Communist Party was able to do was to impart to the South African struggle a quality that no other liberation movement in Africa ever achieved, or certainly to that extent, and that was the principle of non-racism. Now, it was not only the Communist Party, of course, that did that. The Liberal Party, I think, by the late 1950s, certainly was as committed to non-racism and in many ways more involved in African struggles in the rural areas than the Communist Party was. But the Communist Party was able to act in a way as the kind of, if you don't mind a reference to the Milner Kindergarten, as the kind of Rand Club of the African National Congress. The brains, the direction, the keeping of the faith, and most importantly, the discipline. But it's not clear to me that Mandela was ever under party discipline. And I think that is one of the key questions. Did he ever believe that he would take directions from the Communist Party? I suspect not. He was too powerful an agent. He was too much of a personality. And if there were people who felt that the party could control him, he certainly showed that that was not going to be the case. He showed that in prison. He showed that immediately when he came out of prison. Few people perhaps remember that when Mandela came out and gave a pretty dreadful speech, his first speech on the Grand Parade, the speech had been cobbled together and written for him, largely by members of the internal mass democratic movement who were, many of whom were members of the Communist Party or communists or socialists of various construction, who no longer trusted Mandela, who felt that Mandela may have sold out the struggle. And they wrote him a kind of boilerplate speech in which he committed himself to full nationalization, socialist transformation, and so forth, which he read out in very wooden and leaden tones. People don't remember that because of the majesty of the moment. They also don't remember that because he managed to read it out in this rather halting, lawyerly way, in a manner that immediately created a sense of trust, that this was an old-mannered, thoughtful, dignified leader in whom people could follow. It was only the next day when he went to Bishop's Court and sat in Bishop Tutu's garden and completely seduced the press, that the new Mandela, that Mandela released himself. So I think that we need to think very carefully both about these two big questions that are developing in the studies of Mandela. One, the very complicated questions of his self-fashioning and the ways in which he was fashioned and in whose interests people thought they were fashioning him. And there's a great tension between the two. I also do think that it is important, I'm not dismissing the question, I can quite understand that people like Stephen felt very irked by the fact that the response of much of the academic community to the revelations that Mandela may have been a member of the Communist Party, was certainly very close, was one of either disbelief or knowing indifference, or betrayed a kind of fellow traveler, well, we always knew that, but does it make any difference? I think it does make a difference, but I think it makes a difference in ways that we haven't begun to think about. It makes a difference about his decision to lead the armed struggle, who was in charge of the armed struggle, traditions of non-racism, the whole question of party discipline, the relationship with the Soviet Union, the capacity to continue to draw on social democratic support from Scandinavia, from Britain and so forth. All of these things are important, but I don't think that the actual question of membership at a time when the fictional idea of a card-carrying member of the Communist Party was simply didn't apply is something that we should get all that hung up on.
Saul, thank you very much indeed.